Well, we continue this evening with the second in our basically new series of evening sermons, and the theme for our series is actually found in Isaiah chapter 40. You might like to turn there just briefly. I'm very glad to say that the series was interrupted by Ian's opportunity to preach, which I'm always thankful for when he can come and preach for us. But this then is the second time we've had opportunity to consider this theme. And the theme is found in verse 9 of Isaiah chapter 40, where those who bring good tidings, who go up into the high mountains, are addressed. And the message is to be given, the proclamation is to be made, "Behold your God." And in a sense, if you go to the doctors, of course, the doctor will be specific. He will say, well, you need this antibiotic. Many years ago, someone who lived in London and suffered severe respiratory problems, a man was actually an expert in the field of radar and electronics and had been responsible for putting some of the then new radar into capital ships in the Royal Navy during the war. And his breathing had become incredibly difficult. If you probably won't remember, you may know the history, but London had a terribly polluted air in late 40s and early 1950s through the wartime period earlier. And this man's breathing difficulties had become extreme. And he went to the doctors, and the doctor said to him, well, the best thing you can do is to, if you want to live longer, obviously antibiotics and so on were not so readily available. If you want to live longer, the best thing you can do is to leave London and move down to Cornwall. And he actually told him the places in Cornwall he should move to, or the places between. And the man lived for another 30 or 40 years at least. So doctors sometimes give excellent advice without needing to give medicine. But doctors therefore will give different advice. It will be sometimes you need a tablet, sometimes you need to move. I want to suggest to you this evening that whatever circumstance you may be in tonight, and indeed whatever circumstance the Church of Jesus Christ is in tonight, that actually there is one remedy. Whatever the diagnosis specifically, there is very largely one remedy. And the remedy is found in these three words in our English translation of Isaiah 40 verse 9, "Behold your God." The very best thing we can do, whatever circumstance we are found in, whatever difficulty we find ourselves in, whatever joy we find ourselves in, or whatever hassle we find ourselves in, whatever privilege we find ourselves in, behold your God. It will put everything else into perspective, and it will give us a strength. Daniel tells us, the people that do know their God shall be strong and do exploits. If the people of God would be used in the hand of God, would be effective witnesses, not just witnesses, but effective witnesses to God, we must know our God. And therefore we need to take to heart these words, "Behold your God." It is a most vital matter to understand who God is, because there is so much that is termed Christian, that is religious, but essentially it is founded upon sentiment, or it is founded upon superstition. And you find those strands. You find, for example, in the original foundation of what would become the Assemblies of God churches back in America, I think it was in 1904, the Azusa Street meeting, and attending that meeting where that denomination effectively was founded, there were witches. Well, it's not a good way to begin a Christian denomination, and we need to be conscious of that. Behold your God. is something that would stand us in good stead, whatever may be the circumstance we face. And I want tonight to begin with one of the aspects, one of the attributes, if you like, of God, to use a technical term, one of the facets of God's character, if you like. The Word of God tells us what God is like, tells us who God is. And I want to turn to that book of Lamentations where we read a little earlier in our service, even as we began our service, and the 3rd chapter, and to notice the way in which Jeremiah, as he laments so much, and the book of Lamentations is so much a book of sorrow and a book of sadness, and not quite a book of despair, because there is the hope that he speaks of even in the passage we shall just remind ourselves of. I'm going to read verses 22 through 24 of Lamentations chapter 3. But you see, the Christian ultimately is never to despair. Anyone else may despair because there is no way out of your circumstance. There is no way out of the locked cell. All your ingenuity will come a point where it will not avail. Only the Christian has a hope in the one who is almighty. And therefore in verse 21 of Lamentations 3, Jeremiah says, "This I recall to my mind, therefore I have hope." Now, of course, a Christian can be gripped by what we term depression. A Christian can find that their mindset seemingly is altered. Dr. Lloyd Jones wrote a whole volume, or a number of his sermons were put together as a whole volume, which became a little volume called Spiritual Depression. And you may have a depression that is a spiritual depression. You may have a depression that is essentially a physical depression, triggered by your brain in some way. But the Christian always must have in their heart a hope. It may be a very faint hope. It may be a hope that seems to be almost overwhelmed by the circumstances that are being faced. And it may be very hard to fan that flame of hope into anything like life. But there is hope. As Jeremiah is writing Lamentations, the prospect that he sees and the terrible judgment that is coming upon the people of God, and in some places certainly upon Christ as he is foreseen in his sufferings. And yet, for all of the sorrows that he sees, therefore I have hope. And he goes on in verse 22, "Through the Lord's mercies we are not consumed, because his compassions fail not." Well, we won't pause with this, but we might, as we look at "Behold your God," and as we see the facets of God's character, almost like the faces. I sometimes use a comparison. Often, if you look at a ring that is an engagement ring or similar, you will see a precious stone, and you see that the stone has been cut. It has many facets, and the facets reflect and refract the light, and the stone sparkles. And we might have paused with the Lord's mercies. We might have paused with his compassions. Friends, we will just pause for a moment. Do you have a God whom you are confident is a God who shows mercies? Do you have a God whom you're confident he shows compassions? You know, our God is a personal God, a triune Godhead, and a God who is a God of mercy and a God of compassion. And Jeremiah goes on. They are new every morning, because his compassions fail not. They are new every morning. And then this is a phrase that I want to major upon with you tonight. Great is your faithfulness. If you prefer it in the older version, great is thy faithfulness. But in terms of the sense and meaning, there is really no great difference between them. The one is simply an updated English. Great is your faithfulness. The Lord is my portion, says my soul. Therefore I hope in him. Why can you hope in God? Because God is faithful. And I want to suggest to you, first of all, this morning, as we take this evening, as we take this, I want to suggest to you that God's faithfulness implicitly tells us something. It tells us that God has made himself known, and it tells us that God has spoken, and what he has spoken, his character is consistent with. Great is your faithfulness. God has spoken. That is the great beginning, the great opening place. God has made himself known. Let me just take you, if I may, to the book of Psalms. We'll go, first of all, to the 8th Psalm. And I want to deal, first of all, with the reality that God has spoken in a very general sense. And that in what we see around us, in what we term the material creation, God has spoken and God is speaking. You know, people talk about science, and then they talk about Christian belief, and the biblical belief especially, and they suggest that there is a conflict between those two. What is interesting is if you look at the history of the science, you discover that almost all of the great scientists are those who believed in the Christian God. They believed in the Bible. They believed in the truth of God. Don't get confused between John Newton and Isaac Newton. Isaac Newton is the one who had the apple fall on his head and discovered what we term gravity, or the law of gravity. John Newton wrote our tremendous reservoir of hymns. But Isaac Newton actually wrote more concerning biblical truths and expounding biblical truths than he did in his experimental work and his various matters. And he was a remarkable man as a scientist, but remarkable too in his concern for the Bible. But I wanted to direct you particularly in Psalm 8 to this, verse 3 of Psalm 8. When I consider your heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars which you have ordained, what is man that you are mindful of him, and the son of man that you visit him? For you have made him a little lower than the angels, and you have crowned him with glory and honour. You know, it is not unfashionable in our day amongst those who are atheistic scientists that they declare that human beings are stardust. Have you heard that? Have you heard this suggestion that a human being has value because their various constituent elements, they were made in the stars and they are literally made of stardust, and then they will return to stardust? And this is the atheist's hope. And some have even been sent up in spacecraft, their ashes, after cremation, to return them, as it were, to the stars. Well, they're a long way to the stars in the Earth orbit, I'll tell you. They're going to be there for a long while, and they're not going to be very near the stars in comparison. But let me suggest to you that verses 3 through 5 of Psalm 8 are a much better summary of the universe, and a much better understanding of the universe than anything we find amongst those atheistic scientists who talk of the Big Bang. The Big Bang may well work because of the maths, that God stretched out the heavens, and therefore the mathematics, in a sense, is somewhat parallel to what would have happened had there been a Big Bang. But here we have a perception, a spiritual appreciation. When I consider, you know, the psalmist is someone who thought about these things, who meditated upon them. who pondered upon them. He isn't just taking a casual glance at the sky. He's beholding, just as we want to behold our God tonight. The psalmist is considering, and he considers not just the heavens. I consider your heavens. It is the heavens that God has made, the heavens that God has created, the work of your fingers. Now, of course, the psalmist there isn't saying that God literally has fingers. We know that God has no form. The Bible teaches it everywhere, that God is spirit. But he's telling us in English language, in translation, of course, from the original Hebrew, he's telling us that God has wrought these things. God has designed it, the moon and the stars, which you have ordained. And you know, what happens is these atheistic scientists say, oh, well, this universe is vast, is huge, and man is puny and totally irrelevant and just a little ant and of no value. Ah, but you see, here the psalmist knows much better. What is man that you are mindful of him? Humankind. And the Son of Man that you visit him, for you have made him a little lower than the angels. You see, he's reminding us there, just as we can see the planets and we can see the moon and we can see the stars. Well, it's reminding us there in that statement in verse 5 that there's a whole dominion, a whole realm that we simply cannot see. Oh, angels are active. If you're a believer, the angels are ministering spirits sent forth to do service for the sake of those who inherit salvation. Who are those who inherit salvation? Believers. If you're a believer tonight, the angels have a job to do with respect to you. And it may be that in the glory to come, we will discover how you were prevented from being harmed in this instance and being harmed in that instance. And we weren't even aware of the danger. But the angels had charge over us. And they watched over us. And we didn't see them. And just occasionally you might find someone and you might wonder afterwards, was that an angel? They looked like a person, but they just appeared and then they went. And they did something, they helped us, they gave us something, they gave us some information, just disappeared. Could it have been? We don't know. We'll know in the glory. God will show us then. And we'll be thankful for what he did. But you see, here is man, you've made him a little lower than the angels. You've crowned him with glory and honour. That's a general revelation. You look up the sky tonight. Okay, it might be a little cloudy tonight. The other night was beautiful. There were so many stars. But you see, God gives a general revelation. He doesn't have to. He could have done what they sometimes speak of in some theological circles. He could have, as it were, wound up this universe and then just left it to go, and there would have been nothing to reveal himself and no true revelation of God. But turn for a moment to Psalm 19. The heavens declare the glory of God, and the firmament shows his handiwork. Day unto day utters speech, night unto night reveals knowledge. And you see, there is no speech nor language where their voice is not heard. Here is God revealing himself, making himself known through the creation we see around us, through the heavens. There is no speech or language where their voice is not heard. Anyone can look up at the sky, any country. Oh, if you're in Australia, you'll see the stars differently to here, of course. Ruth, if she looks up at the sky tonight, will see a different set of stars to those she's used to in Perth. But you see, it's general, it's to everybody. Nobody could say, I didn't know, I didn't see. God reveals himself in this. They're words to the end of the world. But you see, all that I've been speaking of is God speaking if I can put it like this, generally. When we read God is faithful, great is thy faithfulness, I want to suggest to you there's something much more implicit in that than that God speaks in some general fashion. Yes, of course we see God's faithfulness in the design, in the fact that planets broadly and generally don't crash into each other as a day-to-day matter. Oh, there may have been times associated with the fall when some of the heavenly calamities, perhaps the very moon that God has created as that lesser light, served to protect the world from a bombardment. You look at the way in which the far side of the moon is covered in craters, and if those craters had been caused by impacts that had hit the earth, then it might have been much more terrible disasters upon the earth than there were. And those things may be associated with the fall, with the catastrophe, with the universe being subject to futility. But I want to suggest to you that really in what we see around us, it leaves us inexcusable. I think if anyone looks at a leaf, and remember a leaf now, is a much more effective and a much more efficient way of converting energy from the sun into useful activity and useful energy for us than any of the various solar panels and electric cars and so on that we have. The energy conversion in a leaf is much better than anything that yet a scientist has ever designed. Oh, and that happened by accident over thousands of millions of years, we're told. Whereas the best scientific brains in the world have been working on solar panels and how do you get your car to hold the best charge and to take you hundreds of miles without fading out. Or just look at a leaf and you see the designer, the creator, the architect of the creation round and about. But it's general, you see. But there is, I want to suggest to you, in that expression, great is thy faithfulness, great is your faithfulness if you want the updated version, there is an implicit suggestion that God not only speaks in some general fashion in the universe he's created, but that he speaks in specific fashion in words. Let me give you an example. A husband and wife to be are coming. They're going to get married. They don't make some sort of general statement. They make a very specific statement: to have and to hold till death us do part. It is the marriage that is made by the promises. It is not made by living together. It is not made by some private agreement between them. It is made by a public statement of promise. Now you can argue whether that needs to be made, as it were, consciously in the presence of God. And there were many times when some of the reformers, in reaction against the Roman Catholicism of their day, this is a few hundred years ago, and the understanding of the Roman Catholicism that the marriage was a sacrament, and in reaction against that, some of the reformers deliberately preferred to have no formal religious service in a marriage. Rather, it was seen as something we would see as a civil matter, and the vows were taken in a civil form. Well, I'm not going to try and pontificate upon that. I'm just mentioning it as something that was controversial. But the point is that the husband and wife, whether it is a marriage within a service in a building, a company of believers, or whether it is in a civil service, there is a specific promise made, a specific pledge made. And God, let me put it, great is thy faithfulness, implies that God speaks in words. I would suggest to you it's extraordinarily difficult to really understand what it is that God is faithful and great is thy faithfulness unless God speaks in words. And it is so interesting in Psalm 19 that we move from the universe and the looking at the heavens above, and we see the stars and we see the sun and we see the moon. And then in verse 7, the law of the Lord is perfect. God speaks in words. Now that is the undergirding foundation of our Bible, that God speaks in words, and that man, as Jesus tells us, does not live by bread alone. We considered this morning that second occasion when when the Lord Jesus fed 4,000 men plus women and children, and he fed them with just a few loaves and fish. God speaks in words, and Jesus fed the 4,000 as he previously fed the 5,000. But remember, the one who fed the 4,000, the one who fed the 5,000, he tells us, man does not live by bread alone, but by every word that comes from the mouth of God. And the Bible contains every word that is needful for us that has ever come from the mouth of God. There are words of prophecy that are not recorded because they're not needful for us. We're told in the end, towards the end of the New Testament, we're told some of the prophecy of Enoch, the seventh from Adam. They're recorded in one of the last books of the Bible, in our modern layout of the Bible. But I'm sure there was much that Enoch said that's not recorded. But it's not necessary for us. All that is needful for us to know in terms of what we are to believe and how we are to live to the glory of God is here on these pages. It is in these words. And friends, that is a vital matter. If we are to understand great is thy faithfulness, then we have to be absolutely sure that God has spoken. You know, words become important because of who has said them. Dwight Eisenhower, who was the leader of the Allied forces on D-Day and had in his pocket, as the D-Day landings unfolded, a speech that he prepared in case he had to call the forces back from the beach and to allow that through his failure in planning, the invasion had taken place but had failed. And he had that speech ready to deliver. But in fact, of course, the invasion was in good measure successful and meant that Russian troops wouldn't be occupying virtually the whole of Europe. That's basically what D-Day was about. But you know, we need to listen to Eisenhower when he told us, as he left his presidential office some years later, that the greatest threat to a true democratic system was in fact the axis of the munitions manufacturers and the armaments manufacturers and the highly technical and sophisticated industrial complex that had grown up. Well, as I say, the words of someone depend, the significance of the words depends upon the person and their background and the office. And friends, there is no more important word than the word that God has spoken. There can be no more important word. This universe does not exist by accident. It exists because God willed that it should. And the God who willed that this universe should exist has spoken. And he is faithful to his word, as we could consider further next week. Let's turn in our hymn books to 632 Nearer, my God, to thee, nearer to thee. 632.